Good morning, Dina and Tim. Mark Carney heads to China today, marking the first visit there by Canadian Prime Minister in nearly a decade. Experts are urging caution as Carney seeks to rebuild fractured relations with the world's second largest economy. Michael Kovrig is a former Canadian diplomat who was detained by China for more than 1,000 days. He joins me live now to break down this delicate diplomatic meeting ahead. Mr. Kovrig, it's a pleasure to be speaking with you this morning. A great pleasure to meet you, at least virtually. Thanks so much for making the time.
Good morning, Caryn. My pleasure.
You have insight into the Chinese Communist Party and the threat that it poses that very few other Canadians, if any, have. I wonder if you are supportive of Mark Carney's trip to China and more broadly Ottawa's efforts to rebuild relations with Beijing.
I am supportive of it, but with a lot of caveats, right? The Prime Minister himself has acknowledged that China is the greatest threat to Canadian security. He said so himself, and I would agree with that. And so the challenge, the whole crux of this visit is how can he keep Canadians safe while increasing trade with China, given that it is such a great security threat, right? He needs to do it with guardrails. So, and the risks are that the Canadian government may not be able to build up those guardrails effectively enough through things like a foreign influence registry, through protections from transnational repression, through defense against espionage and IP theft, or through weaponized interdependence by becoming too dependent on selling things to China, as we've seen with our canola farmers and some of our seafood exporters. And a further risk is whether or not Canada is going to have the capacity to protect itself from the kind of infiltration and elite capture and influence that can often come along with deeper economic relations. So there are definitely potential benefits to increased trade and investment with China, but they need to also come with stepped up protections. And that's the diplomatic line he has to walk.
I do want to pick up on your latter point there. Is it possible for Canada to carve out a bigger role for Beijing in our economy while preserving our national security? Does that ability exist in your opinion?
It's possible, but it's risky, and it requires, I think, a whole of government and whole of society response. It requires much greater levels of expertise and education on China and how to deal with it by policymakers, and it requires Canadians as a whole, just as Canadians are currently having to adjust to an increasingly fraught and dangerous geopolitical environment, right, with a resurgent and aggressive Russia, with an increasingly difficult to deal with United States, and also with challenges from China. Canadians need to do more to educate themselves to understand those challenges and figure out how to strengthen Canadian society, to the ties that bind us together as a nation, to defend ourselves from those challenges. Step one is understanding the challenges. Step two is taking real concrete measures to protect them. So one of the key measures of success from Prime Minister Carney's trip is not just what gets said in the meetings or announced at the press conferences. It's looking at what happens afterwards and how does Canada balance increased trade and investment with stepped up protections. So success, and what Canadians should not be looking for a reset. We shouldn't look for that or expect it or want that. This is a recalibration in relations, and success here should be modest, concrete, and reversible, not focused on atmospherics.
You mentioned earlier the trade irritants that currently exist with China, and what we've certainly seen over the last few months is Beijing kind of leverage these trade disputes to kind of fuel political divides between Canada's agricultural provinces and its central Canadian manufacturing interests. And I wonder what you would say to the premiers and to Canadians who are impacted by those industries who may be looking to this trip for some sort of resolution.
I think that you need to have it. Any resolutions need to take into account the interests of all Canadians and the nation as a whole, and sacrificing one group of Canadians or one province or sector for another is very dangerous and challenging. So what you need to do is acknowledge that, look, some people are being hurt by China's current tariffs, right? Canola farmers, other farmers, seafood producers are suffering because that's what China does. Anytime it wants to change Canadian policy or it's angry with China, it looks for the vulnerable points and it presses on them. So the key over the long term is to find ways to reduce those vulnerabilities, diversify trade. Don't sell 90% of any one crop or sector to China. Diversify so that if China cuts you off again, you can manage it and it's not going to hurt so much. And then on the short term, I think we need to spread the pain around the Canadian economy, right? So we can't drop tariffs on electric vehicles outright because that would risk hollowing out the automotive sector and all the related industrial supply chains that keep Canada an advanced industrial economy. It would be devastating for workers and for the economy of Ontario and other parts. At the same time, prairie farmers shouldn't have to pay that price by themselves. And so what we need to do is spread the pain around the economy so that we all help each other. I mean, the reality is we're in a world where great powers are trying to subvert and divide Canadians against each other. The only way we're going to survive is for every province and premier, together with the federal government, to band together to keep the nation strong and defend its interests. And Prime Minister Carney has opportunities to do that in China, first, simply by restoring direct leader-level communication. With China's highly centralized system, having reliable channels at the top, being able to speak face-to-face with General Secretary Xi Jinping can reduce the risk of sudden crises and miscalculation. But that's a baseline achievement, not a breakthrough.
Mr. Kovrig, a final question to you, because you mentioned earlier that you are supportive of this trip and more broadly Canada's efforts. And I hope you don't mind me asking, I just wonder how you feel on a personal level, because I think many humans, had they endured what you endured, might be feeling some sort of betrayal. And I wonder if you've ever felt something like that and how you reconcile that, especially given that there are still Canadians detained in China.
I think those are great, complicated questions, hard to answer quickly. Look, I have mixed feelings about that kind of interaction. But at the end of the day, the challenge is China is so big and systemic that Canada has to be able to talk to China. It's a question of what our leaders try to do through those talks and whether they don't suffer from historical amnesia. They don't recognize that, look, China hasn't changed. What changed is that Xi Jinping decided, because China's economy is suffering and struggling with rivalry with the United States, that it's in China's interest to start talking to Canada again. The Canadian government has been trying to talk to China all along. And if the two countries had just maintained normal diplomatic relations, we would never have had China taking hostages or taking our canola sector hostage back in 2018. We need to have those high-level contacts to manage these problems, but it depends on what we do with them. So success has to focus on narrow, tangible outcomes like lifting punitive tariffs and making progress on consular cases. So one of the key reasons why I support Prime Minister Carney going to China and talking to those Chinese leaders is that it's only through dialogue like that that there's a possibility to advocate for better treatment for all the other nearly 100 probably Canadian prisoners in China, and to advocate for better conditions for them, for their release when they're political prisoners, and to advocate for the release or clemency for political prisoners like Jimmy Lai, the Hong Kong publisher, who this week is going through mitigation hearings. Prime Minister Carney needs to fight both for Canadian economic interests and defend Canadian national security and push for better human rights respects in China. He needs to do all of those things, and that's a challenge for him, but I think that's why he needs to be going there and talking to the Chinese.
Mr. Kovrig, a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much for your analysis and insight this morning. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.